In this video, we're going to cover 6 question types that most students struggle with that 100% are going to show up on your December SAT. And then we're going to talk about 4 advanced topics that you may see at the end of that dreaded second harder module of math. And to wrap up the video, we're going to talk about some really important test day tips. Make sure you work through all the questions, take notes, because by the end of this video, you're going to have learned some really helpful tips that you can apply to your December SAT. Now, the first concept you're definitely going to see on your SAT are modifiers. Now, these are going to be incredibly easy to spot because they are so much longer than all of your conventions of standard English questions. Now, all you have to do to get these right is look at the modifier, which is almost always at the front of the sentence, and you simply want to ask yourself the question, who or what could this be describing? The correct answer is going to have something at the front of it that could be described properly by that modifier. So we simply want to ask ourselves, who or what could have emerged as a flourishing hub of culture and commerce by the early 800s CE? Well, it can't be merchants, it can't be different cultures merchants, but Korean city makes sense to emerge as a flourishing hub of culture. Same thing, different cultures don't make sense to be a flourishing hub of culture. That's how we can find our correct answer of C. Now, the next concept you're definitely going to see is a statistics question, and the most common of those are standard deviation questions. Now, a lot of students struggle with this because they don't take AP stats until they're seniors and they will not have taken the SAT by then. But all we need to understand for standard deviation on the SAT is that it is a measure of spread. The actual values do not affect standard deviation, but the spread of the values do. If values are more closely clumped together, that's going to show you a smaller standard deviation. If they are more spread out, that's going to show you a greater standard deviation. So with that in mind, see if you can find the answer here. Now for this, what we can actually see is the spread in both of the data sets is the same. All of these values are simply 18 greater in data set A than data set B, but they're all spread out equally. First 2 are the same in both data sets, next 2 are 2 greater than the first 2, next 1 is 2 greater than the prior, and the final 2 are 1 greater than that prior term. So the standard deviations are simply going to be the same because the spread of values is the same. Now, to kind of give an example where it would be bigger or smaller, if, for instance, this 24 became a 25, data set A would have a greater standard deviation than B. And if the 24 became a 23, data set A would have a smaller standard deviation than data set B. Now, the next concept you're definitely going to see on your SAT are what I like to call tricky transitions. These will be easy to spot because you'll always see answer choices like A and C with them. Now, with these, there is an answer choice which is almost always right. We're going to talk about that at the end when we kind of talk through our rules around this. But if we follow a simple few-step process, we can get these right every single time. Now, there is a pro tip. If you see an answer choice with a single comma with one of these questions, it is always wrong, so you can immediately eliminate it. Now, from here, the steps we want to go through is step 1 is going to be to ignore the transition for a second. And we're going to evaluate what we have happening structurally before and after that transition. So this is where we need to understand independent clauses, dependent clauses, and phrases. If you're not familiar with those, we're talking about a free resource where you can learn those in depth at the end of the video. But here, we're simply going to check that first. The audience was determined. This can stand on its own. It's an independent clause. Flocking to the theater despite 2 feet of snow and a ban on driving to see the show that would become the well-known Recording the Carnegie Hall concert. This is all a phrase. If you ever have the structure of independent clause to phrase, you have to pick the 2 commas. Now, this is one of the rarer things that can show up on the test. More commonly, so we're just going to do this so we can talk through this so you're prepared for your test, you will get another independent clause. Now, if you have 2 independent clauses, you will be stuck between A and C because they both give a proper way using a semicolon to join those 2 independent clauses. Now, if you are stuck between those 2, this structure is almost always correct in that situation. So if you're stuck, that's your best guess. But what C is really saying is we could take this, however, we could put it back at the front of this sentence. So C is signaling there's a contrast between sentence 1 and sentence 2. A, if we had 2 independent clauses as we're imagining here, would be signaling that there is a contrast between sentence 3 and sentence 2. So if you think about those relationships, that's going to let you understand which one is correct if you have those 2 independent clauses. Now, one of the advanced concepts I think you can see at the end of that second harder module of math are cone questions. I also think there's a good chance you will see a pyramid question on this test. We're not going to cover that in this video because I just released a new video around very difficult geometry question types. So I would definitely check that out because I talk about the pyramid questions in depth. But here we see a right circular cone has a volume of 2,800 pi cubic inches and the area of its base is 400 pi square inches. What is the slant height in inches of the cone? Now, I've popped up the figure that you're given in the reference sheet. A ton of students have either never learned slant height or forgotten it, but the slant height is this piece. So if you see cone questions at their core, they're often a Pythagorean theorem question because we have this triangle. So the base of a cone is a circle. So if the area of the base is 400 pi square inches, we can use that circle formula of pi r squared is equal to 400 pi. And that will give us that our radius is 20. So we know that part. Now we just need to figure out the height. And then we can do a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So we're simply going to use our volume and the volume formula. So we're going to do our 2,800 pi is equal to 1/3 pi r squared, which we know the radius is 20. So we will do the 20 squared times our height. When we solve this through, we will get the height is 21. And now all we have to do is our 20 squared plus our 21 squared is equal to our x squared. And this will give us that the slant height is equal to 29. If you see one of these cone questions, remember to think Pythagorean theorem, and you're going to have a really good chance of solving it. Now, the next question type you 100% are going to see are completes the text questions. And you are definitely going to get at least one or two very challenging versions of this in the second harder module. Now, there's a few things you can keep in mind with these questions to help you get them right. Since these are supposed to be some of the hardest questions on the test, there's a few things you will see. They will dump a ton of information, they'll use a lot of technical terminology, but the overall goal with these questions is identifying how there are details connecting across the passage. If you can pick up how the details connect across the passage, you can find your correct answer. And there's a certain variety of these that shows up a lot, which actually makes your life a lot easier. If you ever see any sort of new information in the final sentence, pay very close attention to that because it's going to function as a filter for what information it wants you to connect back to earlier in the passage. So with these, I recommend paying attention to connections across the sentences, looking out for filtering statements, and writing down notes so you can track the information. If you do those things, you can find your correct answer a lot more easily. So see if you can put that into practice and find the correct answer here. So now I've gone ahead and kind of written down my simple notes. What I notice here is we talk about in the final sentence, but Wace didn't merely adapt history, he added to it as well, introducing the famous round table at which King Arthur's knights assembled, which suggests, well, if we know that Wace is the one who introduced the round table, and that was in 1155, that means round table can first be mentioned at 1155. Now, because we see all these dates in the rest of the text, this kind of lets me know that this filtering statement wants me to pay attention to the dates earlier. So Vita Sancti Cadoci, which was in the 11th century, could not have the round table because the 11th century is the thousands. So then next thing we see is Colwick and Olwen in the 12th century in the second half. This could have the round table. In History of Kings of Britain was from the 1130s. That could not have the round table. Now it's a lot more easy for me to work through those answers and most likely find my correct answer. And that's exactly how we can see that D is correct. The Arthurian legends that the author of Vita Sancti Cadoci drew on would not have featured the round table because it was first introduced in 1155. Now we can still identify why all the other ones are wrong. A, Roman de Brut is more historically accurate than history. Well, this doesn't make sense because these are basically Arthurian legends. We never talk about historical accuracy as well, so we can eliminate that. B, Geoffrey of Monmouth was unaware of the stories of the Round Table when composing his history. Maybe. Though historians know that the works containing such stories were available to him, there is no way we can prove that from the text. For SAT reading, you have to be able to point to evidence to prove the correct answer. If stuff could be true, that is a common wrong answer. C, Geoffrey of Monmouth's accounts of Arthurian legends and history are more similar overall in content to the accounts of Colwick and Olwen than they are to the accounts in Roman de Brut. Well, this would make no sense because Stuff from History of Kings of Britain was adapted into Roman de Bruyne. We don't establish any relationship between history and Culwick and Olwen, so we don't have any evidence for that. The other thing we could look at is Culwick and Owen could have the round table, history could not, but that's how we can see that D must be our correct answer. Now, the next type of question I think you will see at the end of that second harder module of math is a unit conversion question. But in particular, what I like to consider advanced unit conversion questions because they're going to involve either squared or cubed units. So if you're familiar with dimensional analysis, you may feel like you're getting these right, but there's a very common mistake most students make. But see if you can pause the video and figure this one out. So here we see the area of a rectangular region is increasing at a rate of 380 square meters per hour. Which of the following is closest to the rate in square feet per minute? So we always want to start by just kind of writing this out. We're going to have 380. Now, if you see square units, I would write this as meters squared. Per is a math code word for divide, so this is going to be over 1 hour. Now, from here, we need to get it into square feet per minute. So this is the really tricky part. They will always give you your base unit conversion from meters to feet, but we want to go from square meters to square feet. So we need to have our meters cross cancel. So we're going to have our 1 meter on the bottom and the 3.28 feet on the numerator, but this would not properly be crossing out the meters squared. So what you need to simply remember is if you have squared units, you need to square that base conversion factor. And now from here, we want to go from hours to minutes, and we can tell we're setting this up properly. We'll put our 1 hour on top and our 60 minutes on the denominator. Anytime you're using these unit conversions, you can tell you've set it up properly because we'll have our meters squared will cancel out and we'll have our hours cancel out and we will be left with square feet per minute. So once we simply do the 380 times the 3.28 squared divided by the 60, that will give us our correct answer of D. Now, the next concept that you will definitely see on your test are function questions. Now, very basic functions, you're probably wondering why would we be covering these, but these questions actually give students a lot of trouble. This is function questions when they include variables, and this often stumps a lot of students. But we're actually going to talk through is the fact that you can do these in Desmos very, very easily, and it can avoid mistakes and it can save you a bunch of time, especially for something very complicated like this, where you'd plug negative 8k in here, you'd plug k in here, you'd create a quadratic, you have to do factoring. We're going to talk about how you can solve this in seconds. Now, one basic thing to understand with functions is if you have a very simple function like this, if you do something like f of 20, will just spit the answer out for you. So this is why the SAT has started to involve a lot more variables like we see in these examples. So the way we can still sidestep these and simply do them in Desmos really quickly is you're going to write your original expression in, but you're going to ignore this add slider button. Then we need to give it a piece of information. We're going to give it that f of 90, but instead of equals, we will write tilde 120. This is basically going to plug the 120 in for f of x, the 90 in for x. It's going to figure out what k is. And now from here, you can do f of negative 30, and it's going to have plugged this k value in for you, and it's going to spit out that correct answer of B. Now, the other variety that we have here is where we see f of x equals the square root of 8x plus 12. And then what we're told is f of k equals negative 8k. We can use a very similar trick here. We can do f of k tilde negative 8k, and it is going to solve for k. And you can actually go through and simply use that little fraction button, and it's going to give you the right answer. So hopefully you're going to be able to apply this on your test and save you a lot of time and maybe help you get a question that would feel really tricky right very easily. Now, the next advanced concept you will 100% see on the test. It's just whether you see this very, very challenging version of it, and that's discriminant rules. So I'm going to pop those discriminant rules on the screen from my math book. Discriminant questions are questions where you're dealing with quadratics. You'll see an x squared term, and it talks about the number or type of solutions. So you'll see either one solution, no real solutions, or two solutions. That's going to tell you you're dealing with a discriminant question. Now, what makes this particular variety really tricky, and it's shown up on the real SAT a handful of times already, is it doesn't initially look like a discriminant question because we don't see an x squared term. But they like to involve fractions in some really difficult questions. And what we always just want to remember is if we're dealing with fractions, we need to create a common denominator. Here, our common denominator will be 72kx. So just general thing to think about is if you see any sort of fraction questions on your test, make sure you create a common denominator first, and it's going to let you really start to see what you're supposed to do with the rest of the question. So here, we're going to take our 4 over k, and that means we're going to multiply this by 72x over 72x. Then we're going to have our x over 72. Remember, we want to get a common denominator of 72kx, so we're going to multiply that by kx over kx. This is going to be equal to 4 over kx, so we're going to multiply this by 72 over 72. Once we do that, we will get 288x over 72kx plus kx squared over 72kx is equal to 288 over 72kx. Once we have common denominators, you can just cancel them out. So we can now just completely remove them from this question. And now this looks a lot more like a quadratic question. To identify the a, b, and c terms, it always needs to be set equal to 0. So we simply need to subtract this over. That will give us kx squared plus 288x minus 288 is equal to 0. And now we just need to remember we're doing b squared minus 4ac, that's our discriminant, but one solution will set it equal to 0. A value is k, b value is 288, c value is negative 288. So we're simply going to pop that into the formula. We'll get 288 squared minus 4 times k times negative 288. Set that equal to 0. And once we solve through, that will give us our correct answer of k equals negative 72. Now, the next advanced question type I think you're going to see is something relating to essentially just like pattern spotting. And this is going to be where they load questions up with a ton of variables, and you need to just be able to kind of identify some pattern to be able to find the answer. And although these questions almost always look incredibly overwhelming, at their core, they're a lot easier than they look once you kind of understand what you're looking for. So go ahead and pause the video and see if you can figure this one out. Now, when you see these really complex looking questions, everybody initially just starts freaking out because they look at this whole equation and they see these k's and m's and all these variables and the g of 397 equals a and negative 371 equals b, and the whole thing starts to feel really, really overwhelming. But anytime you see math on the SAT that looks overwhelming, always go back to what you would do if it's a super basic version of the same question, because those same basic rules apply and they serve as a really helpful guidepost. So most of you probably know if we're looking for g of 397, we want to plug 397 in for x. If we're looking for g of negative 371, we want to plug negative 371 in for x. If we take that step, we may kind of spot the pattern. So we're going to go ahead and write that out. So now I've gone ahead and written this all out. And what you may notice is after we've plugged in the 397 for x and then the negative 371 in, we get the exact same equation, but we see a positive in the absolute value and a negative in the absolute value. But with absolute value, everything becomes positive. So what this really means is both of these are the exact same equation. So therefore, we know g of 397 equals a and negative 371 equals b. That really tells us that a is equal to b. Well, anything minus itself is 0. Anything to the 0 power is 1. So this just becomes 43, I'll write this all out, minus 397 to the 0 plus 371 times 43 to the 0. So this really just becomes anything to the 0 is 1. This is just the same as 43 plus 371, and that will give us our correct answer of 414. So if you see anything that looks really, really overwhelming like this, go back to the basics, plug the values in. Often the questions are not nearly as complicated as they initially look. You're just looking to pick up some sort of pattern. Now, the last concept you 100% are going to see on your SAT are sentence structure questions. These will probably show up 3 or 4 times throughout the standard English convention. So improving on these can make a huge improvement on your score. And if you find yourself doing these questions based off of what feels right or sounds right, you're kind of setting yourself up for failure. But all we actually need to know to get these right every single time is how to spot independent clauses, dependent clauses, and phrases, and the rules around connecting them. Now, we can tell we're dealing with sentence structure if we see any of those ways of joining 2 independent clauses or 2 full sentences together. In D, the comma plus fanboys, and is one of our fanboys, is one of those options. As soon as you see that, check that answer first and see if we have 2 full sentences, 2 independent clauses. His work challenged traditional boundaries and conveyed powerful messages about race, politics, and society. Well, that's an independent clause. He remains one of the most influential artists of the late 20th century. This is also an independent clause. That tells us we have to pick D. All of these other options, although they may sound okay, are going to create run-on sentences. Now, if you are not familiar with independent clauses, dependent clauses, phrases, and the rules around joining them, please check out the free trial to my Ultimate SAT course. It's completely free. You do not need to enter any credit cards. We're going to teach you all of the rules there. This can make a huge impact on your score. And you can also check out some more advanced question types that have shown up on past SATs and the entire system of equations chapter in our math book. Now, I really hope this video has helped you out. I am going to talk about a few resource recommendations for students, especially with the December test. A lot of students have Thanksgiving break, so they can make significant impacts in their score over that break. So there's a few different recommendations I'm going to make for students. If you have a lot of time over Thanksgiving break and you're really looking to work through additional practice tests, extra hard math questions, fill gaps in content with stuff like this, I strongly recommend signing up for my Ultimate SAT course. It includes all of our SAT offerings, and it's really going to let you dig deep into any of the types of content that you need to focus on. If you are just struggling on the second harder module of math, I strongly recommend checking out our advanced math courses. They've delivered amazing results for students. We've had over 100 students get perfect scores using those. If you have found yourself procrastinating and you're in the last week and you don't have a lot of time and you're just looking to learn the easiest content to improve on that shows up on every single SAT, I strongly recommend checking out our SAT crash course. And the final group is some of you may just be out of practice tests and looking for practice tests that are reflective of the difficulty of the real SAT and the question types that have been showing up there, and then I'd strongly recommend checking out our practice tests. You can check out the first one for only $10 with the coupon code PREP10.